but we know that Zhou Guanyu has signed with Alfa Romeo for 2023, and Yuki signed with Alpha Tauri for 2023 as well. What did you guys make of those notes, and did you find them surprising at all?
No, not necessarily surprising. I think certainly Zhou was expected for a while. Yuki, there was a bit of doubt over. Franz Tost gave some kind of weird press conferences, a couple of races where he said, he was asked, is Yuki Tsunoda staying? And he was like, if Red Bull decides he stays, but it's not up to us. It never really screamed, we're super confident in Yuki. But I'm glad both of them have got an extra deal. I think Zhou's been pretty impressive at points in his rookie season. There's been some points when maybe the results haven't been there, but points on his debut, points at the most recent race. I think he's shown enough to deserve another season and maybe get a more competitive car. Yuki, I think there's a bit of a question mark around maybe mentally with him, how how he approaches racing. But this year he's been really, really good. I think he's stepped up a bit. The interesting thing will be if he's team leader at Alpha Tauri next year, if Gasly moves on. But I like both those guys, so really happy they've stayed. And it's not a case of two drivers staying on purely for the money. I think both performance wise from Zhou, performance wise from Tsunoda, there's been enough there to justify those moves. So yeah, and I'm pretty sure it's a 1 year deal for both of them. So they're basically on another prove it deal, to stay in. So a bit of pressure, but I think that's what Formula One's all about, isn't it?
So we'll essentially have the same conversation next
12
year
months.
regarding
Yeah, exactly.
Their seats as well. You mentioned Pierre Gasly and his future. Nyck de Vries was also rumored to possibly sign with AlphaTauri Lawrence and be the second driver, his teammate, obviously, Yuki. Where are we with that rumor? Where are we with Pierre Gasly at this point?
Well, the remarkable thing now is that Nyck de Vries, who at the start of the year looked like his F1 career was just never going to get off the ground. He'd won F2, he was a champion in Formula E, but it just seemed like he was never going to get that break in Formula One. Now he's the key to the driver market. We talk about these various drivers being keys to the driver market at different times. And it seems like Williams is very keen to offer him a deal. Of course, he subbed in for Alex Albon the last race in Monza, did remarkably well, scored those 2 points. So Williams is keen to get him on a contract. But it seems like AlphaTauri is interested as well. And of course, we know from when AlphaTauri was chasing after Colton Herta, who didn't get the super license points, the American IndyCar driver, in the end, just hadn't done enough on his resume to get the super license. Now, we've had a podcast where we've already talked about the rights and wrongs of that, but that's the reality of it. That's the way it is. And so when AlphaTauri started looking at that, they were thinking, well, we can send Pierre Gasly to Alpine. That solves Alpine's problem of losing Fernando Alonso at the end of this year, not having Oscar Piastri to replace him. And so they're still keen and still, could see it a possibility where Gasly makes that move. And then they could bring in Nyck de Vries in that role, which would be fascinating because de Vries would have gone, like I said, from this driver who didn't look like he had much of an F1 future, was a Mercedes reserve driver, had close links with Mercedes, was driving for Mercedes in Formula E. And then he's actually going to go all the way around to the other side to Red Bull potentially and join their junior team. It's far from a done deal, but it's certainly something that people are talking about. And it's going to be a fascinating one to see how it emerges over time. It kind of makes sense if enough things can fall into place, but it will be interesting to see what the latest rumor is as of tomorrow when I get into the paddock. And it's amazing how quickly all these stories have changed this year with the drive market, and Nico Hulkenberg all of a sudden coming back into the fold at Monza as well as a name being talked about. There's a lot to sort itself out over the next few races, I think.
Yeah, I think de Vries, you say the start of the season didn't even seem likely, but even 3 weeks ago, it didn't really seem like there was, unless, maybe Williams, but until he had that chance to drive, it seemed like Williams maybe was leaning towards Sargent a bit more. And it shows you, doesn't it, that sometimes being in the right place at the right time can be huge. If de Vries hadn't been there as reserve driver, it could have been somebody else. It could have, I believe Van Dorn has been at races for Mercedes before in the same capacity. So it just shows you, and de Vries was a guy that when he left Formula One, or left Formula 2 and he left the kind of Formula 1 paddock, people said, oh, it's a shame, he could have got in, he was probably good enough to, and it seemed like he'd just be another guy that kind of just disappeared into the mist around Formula 1. So it's good to see him get a shot. And if he goes to Alpha Tauri, can you imagine an all-Dutch Red Bull team in a couple of years? Because he's very good friends with Max Verstappen, and I think Max really likes the fact that he's come back and he's raced. You could see Max, once they're kind of done with Perez, being like, well, look, we can get this guy up, I know what he's about. Probably thinks he can beat him, but he's got a mate with him at the team. He'd suddenly have two Dutch drivers at the car at the front of the grid, which for the Netherlands they had so long without a Dutch driver. Now they've got a world champion, and they've got another one who potentially is joining the same program. So pretty wild.
I don't know if they'll be able to handle it, quite frankly.
Well, I don't know how those races can get more orange or more Dutch,
Sure.
but somehow they might have to. I don't know.
Different shades of orange for different drivers. That's how we'll be able to tell the difference.
Thanks so much for watching ESPN on YouTube. And for more sports highlights and analysis, be sure to download the ESPN app. And for premium content and live streaming, subscribe to ESPN Plus.